You are listening to the Brought to Light Masonic Podcast, a podcast for Freemasons and the public, bringing you to light through discussions and research papers about Australian Freemasonry and the Victorian jurisdiction in particular.
And welcome back to the Brought to Light Masonic Podcast. I'm your host, Brother Jack Aquilina, and this is episode 60 of the podcast, which is going to be dedicated to a continuation of our series on future-proofing the craft. And we're going to be joined today by two guest hosts, and of course our good friend, Worshipful brother Robert Billing. Welcome back to the show, Rob.
G'day, Jack. Thanks for inviting me back. Looking forward to it. And
also our good friend, Brother Steve Austin. Steve, it's good to have you back as well.
Thanks very much, Jack. Been a while, so it's great to be back.
Now, we also have sort of passively joining us our official IT man and studio manager, and that's, of course, my Brother Paul Aquilina. Paul, sort of welcome Semele to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jack. I'm standby in case something goes wrong.
Exactly right. And if we do need emergency opinion, Paul's on standby. Now, our listeners are probably thinking two things. Firstly, where have you been for the last who knows how long? I think it's about a month or so. And secondly, where is Dave Illingworth? Now, let me deal with the easier of those two. First, Dave Illingworth has been off gallivanting around the world with his new wife, Jo Illingworth, and they've been, sort of doing all these fun things and putting up photos and making us feel very jealous. Now, as we record the podcast today, he hasn't returned, so we've waited out long enough, Rob. I think we've waited plenty of time for him to come back from his holiday, and he hasn't come back, so we're just going to have to proceed without him.
We've given him a chance, Jack. Actually, I think he's coming back tomorrow, so we're getting in just in time.
He's going to love that. I could just imagine what he's going to say. You snuck one in without me, but oh well, you'll live. But we are, of course, also going to be in a situation where we're going to have to explain ourselves. Now, I think the last episode we did was just before we went to Tasmania, which was over a month ago now. So if you are wondering where we've been and why you've only been hearing American voices on the airwaves, it's not because we've decided that the Americans were going to perform another 4th of July revolution and take us over, but rather that we're actually going to take an impromptu break. This time of year for some has been quite busy. It's been busy for us. We've been probably doing Blue Lounge things almost every weekend, which does take up your time when it comes to doing the podcast. But we are back, of course, and of course we come back at a good time because this just so happens to be 4 days after our 2-year anniversary, which so happens to be the 4th of July, and what a 2 years has that been. So it's great to be back, and we thank all our listeners for their 2 years of listenership to this podcast. 60 episodes in now, it's really been a fantastic journey, and one that we hope will continue for a long time to come. And I guess what we'll do later on is we might dedicate a bit of time and discussion about, what those 2 years have been like for us personally, and how far we've come in retrospect. So, but to our listeners, thank you so much for listening to our podcast for that time, and we're really honoured to be able to deliver the content we do to you on an ever so often basis. But maybe we should get into some Masonic news. Let's get into some Masonic news. Brought to Light Masonic Podcast News. Your news on current affairs and events as they happen in Victoria and around the Masonic world. And yes, we have quite a bit of Masonic news to go through today, and we've had a busy and very controversial period of Freemasonry here in Victoria, and I use that in the most positive way possible, of course, because sometimes controversy can mean a situation where there's contention, but it's for a good purpose. And the controversy, I guess, that I'm referring to, of course, is the vote that recently occurred in relation to the proposed increase in capitation of fees. Now, like we said on the previous episode of this podcast, we don't really mind how you voted in that. We didn't want to take a position. We thought it'd be great for the members to decide what the appropriate capitation fee would be. But I guess putting it more holistically, guys, the significance of this vote was more in the context of the fact that it was the first quarterly communication, or the first substantive quarterly communication that our new Grand Master had the chance to preside over, and also it appears to be the first sort of test for the new leadership team here in Freemasons Victoria, and obviously that vote was obviously a very important part of getting some of their platform through in the early stages of the next 2 years. And obviously with the result being a loss, the motion was voted down by a mere 3 votes. What an incredibly close context, which shows you the real balance of arguments on both sides of the debate and the closeness in which it was reflected in the vote indicates how strong, I guess, the participation on both sides of the argument was. So a very important time, and I guess a very interesting and sort of motion that was put forward at the last quarterly communication.
It was an amazing vote, Jack, for, I think, was it 250 votes each, roughly, or was it 350 votes each?
About 350, yeah.
So many votes, and to be separated by only those was it 3 or 4 votes in the end. It got a bit complicated towards the end of that motion. There were 2 amendments to the motion raised at the last minute to change the timing of the vote and to add some more complication into the sort of the eligibilities for various concessions of the vote. The amendments were very strongly supported, but the vote ultimately was not. And with such a close vote, you would have to think that some people made their mind up at the last minute, and it must have been something that was said at the last minute. Whether or not that brought the vote closer or just tipped it over the line, we're not to know. I was at Quarterly Comms when the motion was first raised by the Deputy Grand Master, Richard Elkington, and it just seemed like a run-of-the-mill motion, but as it's rolled along, it's got more and more complicated, Jack.
Yeah, and I think it really sort of has demonstrated that within the organisation there are elements of those who are opposed to anything that's proposed by Grand Lodge, but also that there is a real reasonable awakening in the membership who not only are considering these things very carefully, but a membership that was otherwise apathetic about these organisational changes is now, I guess since the big vote in September last year, playing a more active role in keeping Grand Lodge to account and paying more attention to quarterly communication. So to get 700 people out for a big motion like that on really what was a cold sort of night in the middle of winter is a big thing. It says a lot about what the membership are doing at the moment. I think we're living in a time of Freemasonry in Victoria where the membership are now more engaged than they've ever been, and they're obviously more concerned about these matters. And like you said, Rob, every vote counts. I think that's very clearly the message that comes from this. Every vote counts, and especially in such a close contest, you know, the ideas and the communication methods that go into communicating the need for change are very important. I think one thing we have to remember is that, you know, as much as the changes that are being proposed are probably, you know, good and probably worth supporting, the burden rests on Grand Lodge to sell the message, not the other way around. And I think, unfortunately, the approach has been, well, you may as well just support it because we're saying it's good, and they haven't discharged that burden. What we've got to be careful of, I think, in my view, coming out of any of these debates, is falling into the trap where we say anyone who didn't support it is just a wrecker. Anyone who didn't support it just wants to see the organisation die. I think that's the wording that the Grand Master used in a more narrower context, which is that there is an element of our organisation that just wants to see it die. I'm a bit more sceptical about that. I think that ultimately there are members who will oppose motions just because they're put by Grand Lodge, but the substantial majority of members just want the right thing to take place, and they don't want the organisation to die. And I think
totally agree, Jack.
The burden relies on Grand Lodge to sell the message.
Look, I think the opposite is probably the truth, really, in terms of people's default voting position. I think there are plenty of people who, if a motion is put by Grand Lodge, just don't even consider the motion and vote for it. So I think Grand Lodge has to look at it that way. That with such strong no vote, it's probably even more so in considering that those supporters of Grand Lodge wouldn't have even considered the motion, just voted for out of duty, so to speak.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, but, you know, I think that you hit the nail on the head when you said that the motion was just getting too complicated. You know, we had a proposal to increase capitations to $150, except we were exempting through a very complicated and bureaucratic concessions regime almost overwhelming majority of the membership. I mean, if you had a healthcare card or a pensioner or were on a fixed income or could demonstrate hardship, or your lodge considered you to be in hardship, you're exempt. So the so-called financial dividend that you're getting was very minimal because it'd be people like me and you, I suppose, that would be picking up the costs because we would be the only ones left who are ineligible to apply for that very broad category of exemption. What the Grand Master did, I think, as we all notice, is in his speech, he was clearly disappointed about the result, but he did say he gave notice of motion that at the next quarterly communication, he'll be proposing an increase of $10 across the board which with no concessions. And I think, honestly, Rob, and you, Steve, if you've got a view on this, I think that this is the right approach. I think a fair increase of $10 across the board without exemptions won't hurt anyone, and I think it's the fair and proper thing to do. I am considering voting for it at this point in time, subject to hearing the usual debate and discussion, but I think that the Grandmaster's instincts on this were brilliant. I think that he's right. Fair increase with no complications is the way to go.
Jack, I think anyone who can find an argument against this is, I'd be fascinated to know what it was. The finances that have been presented to us paint a somewhat bleak picture for Freemasons Victoria. We really have to, rein in spending as well as increase income, and this is one form of income that we've got to get the books to balance so that the lodges, Freemasonry is around, for generations to come.
Yeah, and I think a $10 increase across the board is just the right thing to do. And if anything, the other motion was more inequitable. In an attempt to appease these outrage interests, we had a motion that was never going to succeed. But this one now is a $10 increase, and I think it's something that's very supportable. So obviously, we'll be very much looking into supporting that at this point in time. But obviously, you vote how you wish. That's the beautiful thing about democracy. But in terms of that, let's move on from that topic. Maybe we can move to something a little bit more fun. Let's quickly do a recap on what happened in Tasmania, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we did recently in New South Wales. So, Rob, yourself and Simon and I went to Tasmania for the launch of the Blue Land Social Club of Tasmania. We went also to the installation of David Jordan at his lodge, the Laurie Abbery Memorial Lodge. I think I've got that right, Launceston. I don't know. It's got a lot of words in that name. But he's the worshipful master of a lodge in Launceston, and what a great couple of days it was. Maybe you should share your thoughts.
It was a great couple of days, Jack. Flew down on the plane with your blokes, and we went bushwalking, which was something that you commented multiple times was something that you enjoyed the labours of.
Yes, I'm sure that's what I said.
We visited some distilleries and wineries, and I think we even found time to do some Freemasonry. And it was wonderful to be at the installation of David Jordan. What a great leader and a charismatic bloke. And then we supported him the following night at the launch of the Blue Land Social Club of Tasmania. And again, an excellent event. And David is a quality joke teller. I'll lend you the hot tip. It was a very fun trip, and I'm sure a lot of us will be back.
Yes, and it was so impressive to see so much of his team behind him so strongly, and also to see so many of just the supporters who listen to this podcast and obviously listen to or participate in the Blue Land activities online. So I just want to say to every one of our Tasmanian friends, thank you so much for your support. It is always touching to meet someone and for them to tap you on the shoulder and say, I know you, I've listened to your podcast, or I've engaged with you through email, or whatever it may be. And, it's really something special. And I think it really shows the power of the Blue Land Social Club in terms of its grassroots movement. It's borderless, it's an initiative, it's an energy, and that energy is alive and well in Tasmania. And we're so proud that the Blue Land Social Club there is leading the way. But also, I guess one thing sorry, Rob. On
the same trip, Jack, you were presented with a plaque from the new president of the Blue Land Social Club in recognition of your efforts. So well done there. It was quite a nice plaque. I think you've got it on your wall. I think when I last visited you, Jack.
Yeah, it's on my wall.
And worth mentioning as well is the Grand Master of what do they call themselves? Freemasons Tasmania. What are they actually?
Grand Lodge of. They're not united. I know that they're the Grand Lodge of.
There's something. John Slaw. Anyway, what a top bloke. Him and his deputy Grand Master. They were both there supporting both the installation and the launch of the Blue Land Social Club, and very very strongly supporting this initiative. And wonderful blokes.
I think that ultimately it says something about the difference in culture, I suppose, in Grand Lodges around the jurisdiction, particularly the fact that you had the Grand Master at the launch party and the Deputy Grand Master, and they spoke, and to say that they're not supporting it would be, they are supporting it strongly would be an understatement. I was very proud of the fact that they were there. I think it says a lot about them, and congratulations to the Grand Lodge of Tasmania for the support they've given to their young leaders of tomorrow. It really is reflective of a jurisdiction that really cares about its future, and I don't know, I got a good feeling being in the room, Rob. Now, let's get on to the next thing, which I think, Steve, you might want to jump in on this one. This, of course, a week ago, we went to Sydney, and we went up for the installation of Brother Jano. I won't even have a try at his last name. It's impossible to do for me. But Brother Jano hosted 250 of his friends at his installation to the chair, and we were invited up as the Blue Land Social Club to participate in that and make a presentation, and it was just such a fantastic weekend. So, Steve, did you feel the energy I did? It was great to see so many young people there and so many supporters of the club, both of us here in Victoria and New South Wales, all there in the same place, doing great things.
Yeah, it was great. First of all, I'd just like to say my views on the vote will be in the show notes, because I just couldn't get a word in edge with you two. But the trip up to Sydney was great. Simon Reynolds and I left Friday night and took the Aquilina load up in the car, and we got there early in the morning. But the energy in the prediction room, the Egyptian room, for anyone who's never been there, it's just the room itself has its own energy. But full of Masons from all over Sydney, and obviously us from interstate and Queensland, was fantastic. And the banquet was a great venue as well, with a very well organised event for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was fantastic, and I think it was great once again to hang out with and meet the state president of the Blue Land Social Club of New South Wales and the ACT, and there's, of course, Brother Alex Taylor and his entire team, who are really, really on show. And they've really done great work, Rob. In such a short time, I think it's been 4 months since they've been up and running again, and they've really built some substantial support. And even the Grand Master of New South Wales, the ACT, had some nice things to say about some of the things we're doing online in terms of our movement to recruit and retain young members. So what were your thoughts on the weekend?
It was a great weekend, Jack. A lot of fun to hang out with you blokes in the digs that somebody arranged for us. A nice spot down there near Darling Harbour. And when we were waiting outside to go into that installation, oh my Lord, I've never seen so many people. Possibly, maybe at a grand installation I've seen that many people. Wow. And more people went in, and somehow they found seats for us. And if you look on the Freemasons of Victoria Facebook page, or a couple other Facebook pages, there's some magnificent photos. There's a big panoramic photo, and I think we all managed to get our faces in it. And I stopped counting after about 180 people when I tried to do a head count of all of the Freemasons in the room. It was incredibly impressive. And Jano himself, or Jano, or however you pronounce his name, what an excellent ritualist. And I swear he must have some sort of theatrical background, because he did some very entertaining things in the lodge that got applause. Who applauds in lodge? Anyway, there was applause and cheers and whatnot. And the Grand Master of New South Wales, what's his name?
Jamie Melville.
Jamie, what a top bloke. And he was making some excellent comments, and he got a couple of laughs as well. It was a very fun event. I tell you, some feedback for their south, though. Could have run a little bit quicker. My Lord. I think it went for about 8 hours. That's what it felt like. But some good food in the end. And thank you to those blokes for inviting us up and showing us such great hospitality.
I've never been to a New South Wales south that doesn't go for a long time. Steve and I can relate to a couple of adventures we've had, can't we, Steve?
We certainly can, starting with Burke, and there was an extremely long south up there a couple of years ago with Worshipful Brother Stephen Hall, but this was definitely up there with the length of time. Not quite as many toasts as there was at Burke, but it was an extremely long one. But on the accommodation, I'd like to give a shout out to the Galileo boys, especially their Worshipful Master Dominic, who put us onto that last time we were up there for his installation, and it was extremely central at the Oaks. It was a great value of that.
Yeah, it was great accommodation. 2-bedroom apartment with the balcony and the rest. It was great. It was fantastic. And thank you, Steve, for putting in the work into to organise that. It was a great trip, and congratulations to Brother Jano, and we wish you all the best for the year ahead, and thank you very much for your support. And also to the Blue Land Social Club of New South Wales and the ACT, to Alex and his team, congratulations. We are so proud, and we're so much confidence in you and your team. And if you are a local in that area, we know we've got a few listeners who are locals up there, please get on board and support the Blue Land Social Club of New South Wales and ACT in their efforts to bring more social to the Freemasonry, the craft in New South Wales, and also try and build up some young leaders of tomorrow. Also, quick shout out to Mitchell Hendy, who's a big fan of the show. Congratulations on completing your third degree 1 month early. We had hoped to get up for the one. I'd had hoped to get up there later in the year, but you've done it a couple of months early, and we congratulate you, and we wish you all the best, and thank you very much for listening to the show. One last bit of news. We did have the first inaugural meeting of the International Council of Presidents. That's the part of the International Association of Blue Lounge Social Clubs. The meeting was fantastic, high energy. We had representatives from all our jurisdictions, including our overseas jurisdictions in Bobby Mitchell in Illinois and Alan Nielsen out of Ontario, Canada. It's amazing, you know. I mean, no matter where in the world we were or what accents we used, we had the same issues, the same problems, the same challenges, and also the same hope for the future of Freemasonry. And I think it was fantastic to really be... It was really reassuring to hear that regardless of where we are or how much we think our local issues are a problem, that the challenges facing Freemasonry are a global issue, and that even the issues that this club is facing in trying to build capacity for the future, it's the same problems where we go. So it was a great meeting.
I came in on the end of that as an observer, Jack, and it was a real great feeling. And as you said, it's across the board. We've all faced the same challenges, but it's just good to know that and let each other know that we're not alone.
Exactly right. And I do want to thank all the presidents and obviously our liaison to the Freemasonry in New Zealand, Joseph, for coming along and giving their views. And it's really great to see the club flourishing. And if you do want to set up a new jurisdiction of the club, or you want to get involved in your existing team, jump on the website www.blueloungesc.com. Check out our, where to get started page or how to join the team page, and you'll get an idea of what it takes. It doesn't take much. Your passion, excitement, join a brand that works and be part of the fastest growing grassroots Masonic movement in the world. Let's get straight to our topic. Today we're going to be continuing our future-proofing series, which last time we discussed was based on my paper that I wrote for the Victorian Lodge of Research. That first chapter we spoke about last time was in relation to the challenges associated with the changing role of women and what that means for Freemasonry. And today we're going to be looking at the second chapter, which discusses the changing role of religion in society. Let's get straight into a reading of that chapter, and then we'll get into our discussion.
The Happy Mason Shop, the official sponsor of the Brought to Light Masonic Podcast and the Blue Lounge Social Club. Supporting Freemasons wherever they may be scattered across both Australia and the world globally, the Happy Mason Shop is providing you with access to some of the world's most finest Masonic regalia at the most competitive and affordable prices. Do you need new aprons for your lodge? Whether it be your tatty entered apprentice aprons or fellowcraft aprons that need replacing, or whether it be other furnishings or items it could use to enhance your lodge's presence, or are you being raised to a sublime degree of a Master Mason and require your own Master Mason's apron and don't want to use that second-hand apron that the lodge is offering you? Then jump on the happymasonshop.com.au, click on the Blue Lounge link, and purchase those items to provide yourself with access to some of the UK's best handmade Masonic wares that have been imported into Australia and provided to you at the best affordable price, courtesy of the Happy Mason Shop. The Happy Masons and the Blue Lounge Social Club are united in their sponsorship and partnership, focusing on the recruitment, retention and education support of young Masons and the achievement of Masonic excellence. So check out their store. Every purchase you make via the Blue Lounge link will result in support for us and this podcast, which the Happy Masons are proud to sponsor. So, what are you waiting for? Get your new Masonic regalia at thehappymasonshop.com.au.
Chapter 2. The changing role of religion in society and a new age of decentralized spiritualism and the rejection of dogmatic instruction. One of the greatest myths conveyed about Freemasonry is its apparent propensity to resemble that of a religious organization. This has been a significant burden for the craft over recent decades, especially where society has anchored it to suffer the same fate as organized religion in terms of its decline. In fact, among the many myths and dispersions cast against our fraternity, the most difficult to coherently dispel has been those rumours that seek to depict the craft as a religious body. Many a Grand Lodge has sought to dispel this myth by outright denial of this accusation, pointing towards the craft's intolerance for religious discussion and the niche discrepancies between our practices and the dictionary definition of organised religion. Whilst it is true that every Freemason must trust his faith in a belief of a supreme being, the instant ambiguity of that requirement, in conjunction with its lack of prescriptive dogma, should indicate to an attentive reader that Freemasonry is inherently outside the scope and purpose of organised religion. In his work, The Lost Keys of Freemasonry, Manly P. Hall eloquently contended that the true Mason realises it is life which he considers when measuring the worth of a brother. It is to this life that he appeals for a recognition of spiritual unity. This contention is put more plainly by Mark E. Culture Revere, where he argues that whilst Freemasonry focuses on moral behaviour and spirituality, it itself is not a religion. Freemasonry uses many spiritual symbols. However, Freemasons offer no saviour or plan for salvation. There is no priesthood or ministry, although it is not opposed to such things, but it does not have any of its own to offer. Despite the clear reality that Freemasonry is not a religion, the author submits that it is not coincidental that the craft has experienced a decline of correlating with the general societal decline in religious practice. As with most things, perception is reality, and there is little doubt that Freemasonry has become either closely associated with religion or is thought to be a religion in its own right. While 60% of Australians identify with religious affiliations, the proportion of people identifying with no religion, including people who identify with having secular or other spiritual beliefs, was 30% in 2017, up from 22% in 2012. Age lines separate identification with faith, with younger people reporting no religion at historically higher rates of 39% for Australians between the ages of 18 and 34 years. As is demonstrated in the figure provided in the paper, there has been a significant increase in the members of the Australian population that do not identify with any religion. This trend away from religious affiliation or practice is said to be representative of a growing secular, postmodern, and post-Christendom society. However, despite this decline, as suggested by Boomer, the secularity of the 21st century is not anti-religious or irreligious, with contemporary secularism being better seen as a social condition in which the religious and spiritual have moved out of control of both the state and church. The nature of this contention is intriguing, and as will be discussed in part 2 of this paper, is likely to provide a significant opportunity for Freemasonry to better balance its religious test for membership with a growing secular Australian citizenry. This growing trend away from religion, however, presents the following significant challenges to the craft's ongoing relevance in the lives of man. 1. Where the craft is viewed as being either religious or as a religion in its own right, it is likely to be disregarded by those who do not identify with religion as an anachronism of the past. 2. Even where Freemasonry or membership of the craft is viewed as desirable, the fraternity's strict requirement for members to express a belief in a supreme being, where expressed in traditional religious terms, may prevent prospective members from proceeding with their applications for initiation. And 3. Where non-religious men do proceed with their membership, despite their lack of affiliation to organised religion, they may be difficult to retain due to the craft's emphasis on the religiosity of our ceremonial practices. Whether it be through neglect or deliberate miscalculation, the craft is viewed as either a religion or heavily religious. This misconception is likely to present significant challenges to the recruitment and retention of new members, especially in light of the reality that over time, the Australian population is likely to become substantially less religious and perhaps even culturally more hostile towards organisations that are perceived to be part of the religious establishment. Should Freemasonry wish to remain relevant in the future and not alienate unintentionally a less religious male population, then it will need to meet these challenges by adopting the proposed principal pillars discussed in part 2 of this paper. I'll now commence a reading of part 2 of the paper, which seeks to set out some of the principal pillars that are to guide my solutions or proposed solutions to the problems associated with the declining religiosity in society and its subsequent impacts on the craft in terms of its membership and the challenges it creates for potential members to both join and also retain their membership in the craft. So I've entitled the second analysis associated with the principal pillars around the changing role of religion in society in my paper under the heading of the principal pillars for a modern craft, dealing specifically with principal pillars in an age of a secular, postmodern and post-Christendom society. The distinction between spirituality and religion is understandably a difficult concept to differentiate, and in many cases can become conflated in discussion. For what is spiritual to one person may be insignificant to another, and is very much embroiled in the individual character and perspective of the prospective participant. The decline in religiosity among younger and future generations of men in society, however, requires our craft to better understand and engage members who may reject institutional religion yet live highly spiritual lives. The subjective spirituality of Freemasonry and its capacity to engage in moral and intrinsic questions about a man's individual character is its greatest asset in a period where cultural skepticism is embedded in the minds of our modern society. As has been detailed in Part 1, a majority of modern men are less religious, more skeptical and far less tolerant of dogmatic interventions of institutional religion. Younger generations of men have just come to perceive traditional religious institutions and dogma as contrary to a modern instinct to question the status quo and to approach questions of life and existence from the perspective of individual reason. Individual morality for many young men is found more at home in a class of ethics or philosophy rather than faith, and less certainty is had about the role of one's spiritual dispositions in fostering a meaningful understanding of the world around us. The late Christopher Hitchens' literary work, God is Not Great, is arguably one of the 21st century's most compelling personifications of this growing cultural skepticism and departure away from identification with mainstream religious institutions. Hitchens, unafraid to tackle the biggest questions of faith and reason, ironically provides a fascinating insight about the ethos of modern society with his view of there being a need for a new enlightenment. This enlightenment, he contends, will base itself on the proposition that the proper study of mankind is man and woman. Hitchens continues to suggest that this enlightenment is within the compass of the average person through the study of literature and poetry, the unfettered pursuit of scientific inquiry, with the aim to know yourself, as the Greeks gently suggested in the consolations of philosophy. Whilst Hitchens himself was a profound antagonist of religion and a self-professed servant to his own sense of infallible reason and logic, one can't help but to observe that perhaps the enlightenment he professes is in fact more at home with spirituality than one would first think to perceive. In fact, as many a Freemason may have identified, Hitchens' new enlightenment resembles a great deal to that of the allegorical contemplations of the 3 degrees in craft Freemasonry. In the first degree of Freemasonry, a brother is invited to consider the useful lessons of natural equality and mutual dependence. The allegory that as mortal beings we are but brought into this world into darkness, for which we may only avail ourselves through an understanding of and respect of our fellow man, bears great similarity to Hitchens' enlightenment. Further, the concept that true enlightenment is achieved through a strong pursuit in the education of nature, the liberal arts and science is a key lesson of the second degree. This degree's encouragement for man to avail himself of the secrets of nature and science is presented as an important path to attaining intellectual truth. However, it is the third degree in Freemasonry, with its focus on our inevitable mortality and a contemplation of our finite time on earth, that truly rounds off our capacity to truly know yourself. However, unlike Hitchens, Freemasonry, through its avid contemplation of these lessons, embeds itself in its ultimate understanding that whilst these lessons are founded in rationality, that it is through the spiritual contemplation of their greater meaning that they bear true attachment to our lives and characters. As eloquently put by Brother Owen Shea in his publication Journey on the Level, regardless of the names assigned to truth, emblematic of the Supreme Being, the key point is that the candidate must believe that there is something more, something unknown, and something beyond our limited understanding of the material world, something that relates to the underlying order of the universe and to the true nature of our consciousness. Freemasonry, unequivocally, has the capacity to provide for the modern man an opportunity to expand their understanding of their own intellectual, philosophical, and ultimately spiritual perception of the world and their humanity. As has been demonstrated when deconstructing Hitchens' Enlightenment, the quest for a rational understanding of the world has been grounded in the traditions of the craft for hundreds of years and underpinned in its significance by spirituality. Modern society's propensity towards cultural skepticism has been a true challenge to religion and its role in the lives of younger generations. However, as already indicated, Freemasonry is not a religion. Through Freemasonry, a modern man has the opportunity to confront and contemplate life's most important questions, and through the spirituality of allegorical contemplation, can bridge the divides of diversity to better develop a subjective intellect and morality. As such, it is fundamental, therefore, for our future growth and relevance that our craft and its lodges seek to embrace the principal pillars embodied in this chapter. The principal pillars in this chapter seek to set out the fundamental principles of orthodoxy, culture, and practice that will need to underpin our approach to the practice of Freemasonry in an age of a secular, postmodern, and post-Christendom society. Principle Pillar 1. The craft must dispel any community misconceptions or belief that Freemasonry is a religion, or that it is closely associated with or part of the traditional religious establishment. A quantitative analysis in Part 1 has demonstrated that a significant proportion of Australia's future generation is abandoning mainstream religion and its institutions. Indeed, over 65% of young people today fail to identify with any Christian religion, and instead prefer to list themselves as no religion, or fail to give an adequate response to the census. The growing disenfranchisement with mainstream religious institutions creates significant risk for our craft if it is to be misunderstood as either a religion itself or closely associated with religious institutions. Therefore, it is incumbent upon us to ensure that we dispel these misconceptions. The community must be better attuned and aware to what Freemasonry is and what it is not, with a special emphasis being placed on educating the community as to why Freemasonry is not a religion. There is a substantially strong case to be made against the current tide of misunderstanding. However, much more needs to be done to ensure that society forms a view of the craft as a place where ethics and morals are taught through allegory and symbolism, with a spiritual edge, rather than an expanded place of religious worship. There should be no doubt that if we fail to address this significant misconception about what Freemasonry is and its prime objectives for its members, we risk alienating the overwhelming majority of our future and young membership simply by our association with the decline in institutional religion. Practical recommendations to give effect to this principal pillar. Masonic administrations and Grand Lodges need to prepare aggressive strategies for community engagement and education so as to dispel any misconception that Freemasonry is a religion, and highlight the many secular and Enlightenment traditions that inform our approach to instruction on moral and behavioural standards in society. Lodges need to be better attuned to the viewpoints of young applicants and tailor their message accordingly during the recruitment process to ensure that no misconceptions are formed or sustained. Emphasis on our existing diversity of belief in our current membership and the fact that there is no dogma in our allegorical instructions will be powerful tools to achieve this aim. Members need to be better educated about what the role of religion is in our craft and the significant influence of other non-religious traditions in our teachings. Principle Pillar 2. The craft must design a contemporary expression of our religious test for membership that is more clearly defined so as not to alienate a significantly less religious yet spiritual younger and future membership. Building further on the theme of re-educating the community and our current membership with respect to why Freemasonry is not a religion, naturally flows the necessity of our need to formulate a more contemporary expression of our religious test for membership so as to not alienate future and younger generations. It is conceded that the religious test for membership of the craft differentiates based on jurisdiction. Whilst the majority of mainstream and regular constitutions require a belief in a supreme being, others, especially in southern states of the United States of America, incorporate a necessity for a belief in a monotheist or Trinitarian deity. In Victoria, the constitutions of the fraternity incorporate the charges of a Freemason, under which the heading says concerning God and religion states that a Mason is obliged by his tenure to obey the moral law, and if he rightly understand the art, he'll never be a stupid atheist nor irreligious libertine. Clearly these charges of a Freemason were written at a time and in a period of history that is quite remote from that of the 21st century. Naturally, aside from the obvious changes in the use of language over time, reliance on these ancient charges in a literal rather than symbolic sense would be both irrational and needlessly antiquated. In his paper, The Masonic Ritual of the 21st Century, Worshipful Brother Alan Richmond highlights the significant tensions and mismatch that arises between a literal interpretation of Victoria's Masonic ritual and the values that underpin modern 21st century society. Within this very learned analysis, Worshipful Brother Richmond highlights that it is interesting that the ancient charges decree that a Freemason can never be a stupid atheist, nor an irreligious libertine. I would suggest that this too is obsolete moral rhetoric. Respectfully, this contention advanced by Worshipful Brother Richmond should be adopted. The reference to the ancient charges needs to be understood in a symbolic sense, rather than through the blinkered perspective of needless and irrational literalism. In fact, the practice in Victoria appears to already accord with this contention. Article 217 of the Constitutions in Victoria sets out the requirement for membership of the craft. At no point within this exhaustive list of criteria for membership does reference to a belief in a god or a supreme being arise. Article 217 subsection D, however, does mandate that a candidate is to complete a Form A, being part of the second schedule annexed to the Constitutions. The second schedule itself only makes one reference to the requirement for a candidate to have a belief in a supreme being once, where it provides as part of the candidate's declaration that, and I quote, I, insert name, being 18 years or older prior to my initiation, acknowledge my belief in a supreme being and offer myself as a candidate for Freemasonry. The Freemasons Victoria website only offers the following explanation as to the religious test. Freemasons are required to profess a belief in a supreme being. The specifics of that belief are considered to be a personal matter. As such, it cannot be concluded that despite the anachronistic attitude of the ancient charges, that the constitutions and practices of Freemasons Victoria reflect a more appropriate religious test. Nonetheless, however, the test appears to be that candidates for initiation must declare a belief in a supreme being. The Oxford English Dictionary definition of the phrase a supreme being is that it is a reference to a name of God. Whilst it is not this author's contention that the requirement for a candidate for initiation to have a belief in a higher power should be removed, it is submitted that the expression of that requirement in the form of a supreme being test creates challenges in light of our secular, postmodern, and post-Christendom society. One can't help but rhetorically ask, does our current religious test simply ask candidates to declare a belief in insert name of relevant God here? If that is so, are we therefore restricting participation in Freemasonry to only those who participate in organised religion? The answers to these rhetorical questions are not insubstantial. Should our current test restrict membership of the craft to men of organised religion, then our craft exposes itself to the serious risk of anchoring its fate to the rapidly descending ship of religion, whilst at the same time de facto excluding the overwhelming majority of the future Australian male citizenry from membership. Additionally, at least from the anecdotal experiences of the author, a restriction of membership to those whom declare a belief in a god of an accepted organised religious institution would be out of step with our current practices. Therefore, it is necessary that the religious joining test be better and more clearly defined so as to be conducive to membership of men in the 21st century. The author contends that the utilisation of the word supreme being unnecessarily restricts our membership to those men who belong to organised religion, or at the very least may be perceived by modern men as mandating that requirement. As discussed in Part 1, modern men are not anti-religious or irreligious, with contemporary secularism being better seen as a social condition in which the religious and spiritual have moved out of the control of both the state and church. Should this be accepted, it is a likely conclusion that the trend away from an identification with religious institutions by young Australians is merely a move away from the religious establishment, with many maintaining spiritual or religious beliefs and practices despite identifying as atheists, agnostics, no religion, or other. Therefore, any test for religiosity applied to new and future members should be sufficiently broad enough to capture and reflect the significant variations of belief that exist in the modern Australian community. The term higher power refers to a spirit or being, such as a god, that has great power, strength, knowledge, etc., that can affect nature and the lives of people. This term, by definition, is clearly broader than the term supreme being, and clearly includes within its scope beliefs of spiritual or analogous nature to that of an organised religion without limiting it to that unnecessary requirement. As such, the author submits that an appropriate religious test for secular postmodern and post-Christian society is that candidates for initiation be required to acknowledge a belief in a higher power as a condition of membership. Practical recommendations to give effect to this principal pillar: that the religious test be changed from acknowledgement of a belief in a supreme being to an acknowledgement of a belief in a higher power; that Grand Lodges and constituent lodges should continue to practice the practice of only ever asking a candidate once or twice to confirm they meet the relevant religious standard without any further investigation, inquiry, or examination as to the nature of that private and personal declaration of belief. Principle Pillar 3. Internally, the craft must analyse and make clearer to its members why its ceremonial practices are based in the Abrahamic religion, but is not of itself the expression or imposition of Abrahamic religious practices or dogma. Throughout the Masonic world, there is a great debate about the history and origin of our ceremonial practices and expressions. Particularly, in some communities of Freemasons, it has been suggested the craft is a Christian institution that requires its membership to have an intimate understanding of the Bible in order to attain complete enlightenment. In fact, many a jurisdiction has sought to impose this narrow interpretation of our Masonic tradition on its membership through its joining criteria, restricting participation in the craft to those of the Christian faith. Jurisdictions such as Victoria, however, boast frequently and celebrate our membership's apparent diversity of belief. Anecdotally, the author frequently hears statements such as, "On the Master's pedestal we have all three books, the Christian Bible, the Jewish Torah, and the Islamic Quran." Whilst this diversity in religious belief and tolerance in our lodges should be celebrated, and in of itself represents one of the great achievements of our fraternity, such circumstances represent less diversity on a holistic view than one would first think. Despite the differences between the three major religions, they unquestionably share near identical origins, being all institutions of religion that claim descent from the practices of the ancient Israelites and the worship of the God of Abraham. Therefore, it would be difficult to conclude that the influence and practice of the Abrahamic tradition within our craft's ritual and ceremonies is anything other than significant. True it is that our ritual is based on the building of King Solomon's temple and the circumstances surrounding the erection of that edifice. Conceded it must be that the ethos, symbolism, and practices of our lodges are deeply embedded in the pages of Abrahamic scripture and writings. However, to suggest that Freemasonry is an institution dedicated to the practice and furtherance of Abrahamic religion, just because the vessel of our information sharing happens to be draped in Abrahamic allegories, would be, in the author's submission, erroneous. The practice of Freemasonry and its ritual expression is much more than the regurgitation of Abrahamic religious practices, and nor is it designed to be an additional place of worship to God or the furtherance of particular religious institutions. Freemasonry envelops traditions of a much broader influence than those of the Abrahamic institutions of religion. Doctrines of thought and practice from the Enlightenment, Reformation, and scientific rationalism are also prominent in the practices of our craft. Political philosophies such as the respect for the rule of law, equality of opportunity, freedom of expression and debate, democracy, and decentralized religious practice are also defining characteristics. We borrow from the ancient traditions and orders and mystic schools that are hundreds and in some cases thousands of years old, combining some of the best of Eastern and Western philosophy and practice. Fundamentally, and above all, however, Freemasonry is free of dogmatic instruction, and its core operating ancient landmark is a respect for decentralized personal belief and the sacred private development of the inward man throughout his time on this earth. That is why Freemasonry is not a religion and never will be, and for the sake of its lack of dogmatic instruction and our preservation of the sanctity of private belief and expression, that Freemasonry can ensure it remains highly relevant to men in our secular, postmodern, and post-Christendom society. This relevance, however, will depend on a great deal more than our capacity to outwardly dispel misconceptions of Freemasonry being a religion, or formulating our religious test of membership so as to make it as broad as possible without contravening our ancient landmarks. Our members, internally, must better understand, appreciate, and celebrate the fact that whilst Freemasonry uses the allegorical contemplations of the Abrahamic tradition to share and communicate its core morals and ethical canons, that in of itself it is not designed to be a place to impose Abrahamic dogma, or to be an extended place of religious worship for members of organised religion. Our future relevance in the lives of man will depend entirely on our capacity to provide an experience and practice through which one can comfortably identify and relate. The reality is, our world and its religious identity or expression is fundamentally changing, and if we are to survive, so must we. This is not to suggest that we must change what we are or what we do, but rather to recast ourselves in a manner that will enable the sanctuary of our temples to be the spiritual home for a broad class of men who believe in a higher power than that of man, and who has chosen to become a brother in the pursuit of inward growth and the attainment of his subjective account of perfection in life. Practical recommendations to give effect to this principal pillar. Grand Lodge and lodges need to better educate our membership as to the fact that Freemasonry, whilst utilising the allegories of the Abrahamic tradition to convey its moral teachings, is not an institution that is dedicated to the imposition of the dogma or practices of organised religion. Grand Lodges and lodges need to ensure that they foster an environment of intellectual discussion and consideration of the very many influences, practices, and traditions on Freemasonry in its modern expression. Grand Lodges and lodges need to ensure that each member is able to benefit from a lodge experience where they can comfortably identify and relate to the morals and ethical canons of the order through the sanctity of private belief and expression. Okay, now we've returned from that reading. Let's get straight into the discussion. Now, just to do a bit of a summary, because I know there's a lot in that, basically what I was saying is that we're focusing on some of the issues that the lack of religiosity in society is creating for Freemasonry. Because, as you know, Freemasonry does have a requirement that we believe in a supreme being before one can become a member. Now, if we have a larger and larger proportion of society, especially millennials, who are the future generations of members who don't identify with religion, what sort of challenges is that going to create for Freemasonry? So in that chapter, I sort of highlight the fact that this is a challenge, and there's certain aspects of Freemasonry that culture conflicts with. So I guess what we should be discussing today, and we'll use the paper as a bit of a guide, but we'll discuss maybe some of the solutions to those problems. Rob, do you have any thoughts on the problems that we face in terms of the declining religiosity in society, especially as it relates to institutional religion, and obviously our position as Freemasons? Just an easy question I'm chucking at you.
Do I have any thoughts on the declining religiosity? I'm glad you said religiosity, Jack, because I don't get to say religiosity. Enough. Look, in your paper, I spent a bit of time looking at the graph that you've shown from the census, showing the decline of recognised religions, people being reported in the censuses over time. And I found it very interesting. Back in 1900, I think you've got about 80% as religious, and now, or maybe 90%. I think 80% Christian. Whereas now we're looking at it closer to 60% religious these days. And I think that, I mean, most people would know in themselves that type of change is happening. You see it much less in schools these days. But as to why religion is declining, I'm not. I haven't done enough study, Jack. Although I do agree with a lot of the conclusions in your paper.
But do you think, so I've identified 3 areas of challenges I think that it creates for us in Freemasonry. For example, the growing trend of away from religion creates issues where we're seen as a religion ourselves. I mean, do you think that people think Freemasonry is a religion?
Every time I talk to someone about Freemasonry, they link it to religion. and it's unfortunate. And as you've pointed out in your paper, Jack, it's something that we need to address, because we're not in a religion, and having to keep repeating ourselves like a broken record should highlight to us that we're not doing enough to illustrate that. And as you've correctly suggested, I think we may be overblowing the fact in when we're talking to new members, or when we're sort of saying the requirements of becoming a Freemason. We may be overblowing that requirement for a belief in a supreme being, or indeed, as you've said, the wording of that requirement may not be correct.
Yes. What do you think, Steve? I mean, I know that you see both sides of the fence because you're quite involved in religious groups yourself. Do people think Freemasonry is a religion?
Straight away, Jack. When they approached me, you know me, I've got my shirt on now, I've got my belt buckle on every day. I'm a walking billboard for Freemasonry. And it's the first thing that most people will link it up to is, it's either a cult or a religion. But look, I think the decline in people going to church or to religious places is extremely noticeable just by looking at comparing the age groups. I take my mother to church most Sundays, to St Michael's Uniting, which is a very, very progressive church in where they preach in a new faith and a presence of God, which is very relatable to how we relate to the Supreme Being in Freemasonry. But just looking around the church, it's the same age demographic in the church than it is in Freemasonry, if that makes sense. But the other thing I think that I agree with what Rob said is we just, and as your paper says, I think we focus too much on that question of the belief in the Supreme Being when we're talking to new candidates. And I mean, you simplified it. We've done a couple of new candidate interviews together now, Jack, and you simplify it, and it's just a question, and you'll only hear it once or twice when you're in your obligation sort of stages. So, I think we need to get away from that a little, as before talked. But it's definitely a comparable problem with religion in society and in Freemasonry is very comparable.
Is Freemasonry, how important is religion in Freemasonry though, do you think? Because I sort of contemplated this topic when I was writing my paper. Maybe one of the criticisms one could make about my paper is it projects my perhaps very subjective view that a lot of what we do in Freemasonry, absolutely everything we do in Freemasonry is allegorical. So in my view, references to God and the higher power and all that is simply an allegory for something that's personal to you. But some people, especially some of our American friends, and the Masonic Light Podcast have had a couple of scholars on their show who have said that if you haven't read the Christian Bible, you are not a good Freemason, because you, without an understanding of the Bible, you don't understand Freemasonry, or Freemasonry without Christianity is not Freemasonry at all, that sort of thing. And there's some jurisdictions in the southern states of the United States who maintain that Freemasonry is a Christian institution, a Christian organisation, which obviously is the antithesis of what we do here in Victoria. But going back to the root question, how important is religion to our practice of Freemasonry, do you think?
For me, Jack, I think it's not particularly important. You've got to tread carefully with some of these issues, obviously, because some people find these things incredibly important, but I think you could be a perfect Freemason with all of the morals and ethics that we ask of you, with little to practically no religious inkling. Even in lodge, we don't ask people to pray. You don't see people closing their eyes or anything. When we do an obligation, we're talking about your honour as a man. And certainly there is a brief reference to God in our obligations, but it's not a strong one.
We open.
What do you think, Steve?
Steve, what do you think? We open the lodges with references to God as well. Don't forget.
Yeah, we do. We do. There's an opening prayer, obviously, in each degree, and but I do agree with Rob. I think you can still follow the morals of what we teach and not have very little religion. I mean, I probably take a little bit more into it because of my own link to what I have, but I also agree with Jack. It depends on the allegorical sense of the word or the background of your own journey is what you take out of it. And You know, some people might get that from reading the Bible and getting more out of it. But I mean, we've got to also look at the other religions that come into it, because, you know, in Indian lodges they have, for example, 5 books open of their volume of the Sacred Law, because there's so many different religions meeting together. So when our ritual relates to more the Christian Bible, then, you know, it'd be interesting to have a view of how other religions see the links to through our ritual to that particular story.
Yeah, I mean,
I'll just correct you there, Steve. Although, whilst you're technically right, this stuff is in the Christian Bible. It's really the Jewish Bible where all of this stuff comes from. The Christian element is really
Sorry, the El Torah. My bad.
Yeah.
Well, I take it to the next step. I say Abrahamic, I suppose. Abrahamic religions. Yeah.
Yeah, but I know we always fall into a trap. I suppose in Australia, of when we refer to religion, we're almost talking about Christianity when we say religion. But I suppose in these days we're much more broad about that reference. And when we mention the Bible, we're almost always talking about the Christian Bible, or you mentioned the volume of the Sacred Law. You're almost always referring to the Christian Bible, but it's not that case, of course.
Yes, I guess one point I wanted to ask as well is, in our discussion we said that so far that, you know, some lodges have multiple religions, multiple faiths, multiple books on their tables and on their altars. Now that sort of brings up a broader question. You know, is our belief in supreme being restricted only to a belief in institutional religion, recognized institutional religion? I mean, can you only be a Hindu or a Scientologist, or, you know, whatever it may be? Where do we draw the line? What about someone who doesn't believe in institutional religion but believes in something like a personal God or a deistic God or a non-organized God, a God that doesn't have an institution backing it?
Well, I think that's a very good point, Jack. I think, because we've got to remember when our ritual was written 300 years ago, when look at the census said, what is it, 90%, Rob, I think you mentioned, in 1900. So how much of society were following a religion or a strict religion when our ritual was written? So it's definitely somewhere that's got to be, the line's got to be open a bit more. It doesn't have to be so institutional, as you say. I think it needs to, in order to get more recruits and candidates in, and because there's plenty of spiritual people out there that don't believe in a dogmatic God or institutional God, as you put it.
I think some of the words that we use to put to the candidate to ask them if they have a belief in a supreme being or whatnot, I think some of those words may imply they have to be a member of a recognised religion, which is not true. And I've been on a board of inquiry a number of times, and we make it very clear that we're talking about much more wider things than recognised religion. But the text of some of the documents may not be clear about that.
What if you don't have a holy book?
Well, you have to pick on, Jack. You have to put your hand on something. What do you do in the court in that case?
You make an affirmation.
Wow, bloody hell, we're not going to make affirmations, are we?
They promise on their honour as a person unbound by God that they'll be able to discharge the duties of the court. But I guess
maybe I'll take my next obligation on the Constitution of Freemasons Victoria, mate. I know that pretty well.
But this is my point, right? This is my point. If we're not linked to institutional religion, or we shouldn't be, then maybe we need to reassess all this stuff, because this stuff all points in one direction, that we're biased towards institutional religion. And I think we're being very generous when we say that we're open to more than simply the main 3 Abrahamic traditions. I even question our openness to Islamic tradition. Not to say that you can't join in the rest, but I just don't think that we embrace that sort of cultural aspect that it goes part of that. I think Freemasonry was designed through a Christian lens. But I guess the question my paper provokes is, what can we do to ensure we modernise that, to make us more contemporary and relevant, especially in a society where we're post-Christian, post-Christendom, as they call it.
I know we like referring to the volume of the Sacred Law because it's sort of non-denominational, but I'm pretty sure I've seen old rituals that have the Bible in place of saying the volume of the Sacred Law. So I think that's only a sort of a past 100, 150 years thing.
Well, behind me, I don't know if you can see, I've got a Holy Bible up there was given to me. That's what we use in our lodges across the world. Generally speaking, I've seen them everywhere. That book is that's meant to be a Masonic book. It's a Masonic Bible. So I don't know what that says about Freemasonry. In the front of it, it has all the references. It has a list of all the references that the Masonic ritual has to the Christian Bible. So it's interesting, isn't it? But these are the questions we should ask. In my paper, as you've already heard, I've already made some suggestions about what we can do to break the chain of, the association between us and institutional religion. We must move away from that. We must not jump on the sinking ship of religion, and we need to obviously make our purpose clear that we're about intellectual, spiritual, and personal enlightenment through subjective understanding of allegories, rather than this idea of a dogmatic institution that promotes a certain God. I think that's very, very important.
Although I like your term, the sinking ship of religion, Jack, I'm not sure it's 100% accurate. I think there are some religions that are flourishing in the world with the need of people to have some belief in something. I
think all the data suggests in the West that it's struggling. I can only speak for what's happening in the West, and I suppose to the exception would be the Americas. I mean, the sort of evangelical New Age Christianity that's happening there is really something that hasn't happened across the rest of the Western world. But who knows?
Yeah. And look,
speaking, go Rob.
So some of that evangelical religion, they are doing wonderful things for communities and for people in bringing people together and giving people hope in a lot of areas. Fantastic work some of those churches are doing, and I hope they do thrive.
I was just going to bring it closer to home in my own experience for a second, Jack, if that was fine.
Go ahead.
Speaking specifically here in Melbourne, I mean, I've been trying to negotiate to get a modern day minister on the program. We're still working on that, but he won't mind me mentioning his name in Reverend Rick Holland, who's been a supply minister at my church for the last 6 months. He's had a profound influence of getting young people to church, as far as running young people's breakfasts and that kind of thing, and looking at religion going forward for the next 50 to 100 years in Melbourne. He started a walk Good Friday last year and ran it again this last Good Friday, where all the heads of different religions in Melbourne came together and walked from one end of Melbourne CBD to the other, and it's been well attended by over 2,000 or 3,000 people each Good Friday. So I think religion in Melbourne's strong, but it's definitely dying in the western areas. But there is people out there that are pushing not to modernise it, as you say. And I think this new faith that Dr. Francis McNabb's put through at my church in the last 40 years really preaches that about the presence of God and what is your belief and what's your journey, which just relates straight to Freemasonry. Again, that's just my opinion, but because that's where I attend.
Yeah, I think that's more in line with our sort of hands-off approach. I think it's more of a resurgence of what we saw, in periods such as the English Civil War, where we saw a rejection of some of the more Protestant and Catholic type religions, which were very much about idols and the institutional strength and power of the church and the imposition of power from the church down to its followers, to a more what the Puritans called a personalised religion, a religion that lacked idols, a faith and connection directly between God and the worshipper, rather than there need to be a link between God and the institution. So that's how religions have maintained power in Europe for a long time. The argument that you can't reach God unless you are part of an institution, whereas the Puritanic sort of approach was this idea of a relationship between God and the worshipper directly. And I think that's more consistent with what we do in Freemasonry, because we say to you, well, we don't care what your belief in a higher power is, so long as you've got one, and you should go off and maintain and strengthen that personal relationship in your own way, in your own means, and we're not going to sit here and tell you how to do that correctly. I think that's what's beautiful about Freemasonry in that respect. But I guess this leads into the main contention of my proposition in relation to religion, and that is the changing of the word, or the religious test. And I know this can be somewhat controversial. In fact, it has sort of provoked two approaches of criticism. One saying this is really unnecessary because it's a semantic argument. I'm arguing semantics. The second argument says, no, this is fundamentally wrong and moves away from the landmarks of Freemasonry. So let me just clarify what I'm suggesting. In my paper, I've suggested that what we do is we change the test from a requirement of a belief in a supreme being to a requirement of a belief in a higher power. And the reason I do that is because I'm focusing on the ordinary and plain meaning of the word. Supreme being refers to the name of a god, which indicates to me the name of a recognized or an institutional god, a god of a mainstream religion. Whereas a higher power refers to a god-like entity, a belief in something a bit more lucid, a bit more analogous rather than specific. And I think that what it does, and I think even the sound of it, to be honest with you, we can test it on you both today. If you approach someone and said, oh, look, to join Freemasonry, you need a belief in a supreme being, or to join Freemasonry, you just need a belief in a higher power, I think that has different connotations. And I think it's a very easy and adjustable change we can make that might have a difference. What do you think?
You're spot on. It does have a different connotation, Jack. There's no doubt about it. It does conjure up different imaging. I do worry that we might be arguing semantics. I sort of agree on that level. Given the word supreme being is only ever used on the membership test, and then in Lodge we use other words, and we would be struggling to get away from those words. So that'd be my feedback there, Joe.
Yes, I suppose we do ask if the candidate believes in God, but once again, we could argue that away by saying that by the moment you enter the lodge room, everything's allegorical.
Yes, that makes sense.
We could argue that. But as I guess sort of mentioned, people think this is ingrained in the ancient landmarks. Nowhere in our constitution does it say that you must have a belief in a supreme being other than a reference to the need to fill out a form in Schedule 2, which is our pro forma membership application. Which so happens at this point in time to be made it's made by regulation, and that particular form just happens to say you declare a belief in a supreme being or acknowledge a belief in a supreme being. So it's not really that rock hard. It's not like the number one requirement in the Constitution that you must have a belief in a supreme being.
What do you think, Jack, if we change it to say that you're not a stupid atheist?
Well, I think I mentioned that in my paper that the reference to that is clearly allegorical, and to take it any other way would be to be acting in the absurd. I think is the right word.
It's strong words. You might want to fill in our listeners as to what I'm referring to, Joe.
So in the ancient charges of a Freemason, which is goes back to the old days of Mackey, they form the sort of the basis of all the recognised constitutions of Freemasons, and in that, one of the ancient charges says that a Freemason shall not be a stupid atheist, which clearly, at the time, even the word stupid would have meant something very, very different to what it does today. And I think that naturally through time that meaning has to be interpreted as a living meaning and would have changed quite substantially. So this reference to that is usually relied on as a way of saying, well, you can't have a loose requirement or a belief in a supreme being. And we also tend to insult atheists by calling them stupid. But I'm very much sure that we shouldn't rely on that anymore. That's definitely not... It's lost in time, I think, in cultural relevance.
I think
Agreed.
You tried to change it, Jack.
Well, I mean, let's not change it. Let's just ignore it. That's the best way to work these things.
Exactly.
So,
ignore it.
I think it's the best way to go. But I'm sure there's a number of Freemasons banging on the table right now saying that I'm committing blasphemy. But in saying that, I have to say, and this is just a personal confession, Freemasonry has probably made me more religious than what I was when I joined. Don't know why. It has.
I'll agree with that, Jack. You definitely, I think you're more connected to yourself than when I first met you. I mean, I've only known you since you've been a Freemason, but talking to you and to Paul and about how you were before joining Freemasonry, and I know it's connected me to myself better. I mean, I've attended church nearly all my life, but I've definitely become more connected to myself through the channels of the religious links and the morals we do in Freemasonry.
What about you, Rob? Has that an impact on your religiosity or spiritualism?
Not that I've really recognised, but I would comment that like to spend a lot of time learning charges and going over them again and repeating and repeating and repeating, and by doing that, it ingrains those principles in you by default. And of course, we have some sort of quasi-religious stuff in our rituals when we're referring to God and your duties to God. And in repeating that, it does somewhat become ingrained in you.
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, it's made me appreciate the Judeo-Christian approach to the world, to be honest with you. The foundations of Western civilization is based on this idea of natural equality, which is a huge part of the lessons, at least at the first degree. It's beautiful. I think it's enshrines some of the best traditions that have made Western society what they are today, which inevitably incurs secular views that come out of science and inquiry and the Enlightenment, but also some of the best of the Judeo-Christian ethic, which fundamentally forms part of our modern approach to the world. I think it's really brilliant. But it's interesting to hear your views on that, and I think it's been a very good discussion about that aspect of my paper. And we haven't solved all the world's problems over this conversation, but hopefully we've invited our listeners to really consider some of the challenges we face and what we can do to not abrogate the ancient landmarks, but also ensure Freemasonry remains relevant going into the 21st century. I think that's our aim, and we have to do it if we're going to survive. I think that's very, very important. Now, any last thoughts from you both on the topic before we move on?
Jeez. You've wrapped me up quickly, Jack. I had loads more to say.
Go ahead.
I've got a whole list here. I know you in your paper you refer to the Abrahamic legends, and it's interesting that whilst we refer to the Abrahamic legends, specifically King Solomon's Temple in Kings 1 and 2, I think it's in Kings 2 as well, and it's about the building of King Solomon's Temple, and we pull a lot of stories out of that, and we use them in Freemasonry. I find it interesting to reflect that ultimately the temple that King Solomon was building was not a practical temple. This wasn't a temple that he was using to house anything or to do anything particularly with. It was a monument to God. So what Freemasons are doing in building that temple is building just a monument to God to thank Him and to praise Him, so to speak. It's interesting that the particular Abrahamic stories that we've chosen to base our rituals on very clearly have a strong religious bent at the end of the day.
I think that's just reflective of the fact that when the ritual was written, it was written by people, and in a time where the aristocracy knew the story well. They'd learnt English and conversation and language through religious texts, and that the everyday layman could understand through their understanding of fables and stories that have been told to them at church. I think that's all really it is a reflection of. As strategic as it is, and in hindsight, we may be able to read into some, symbolic and spiritual significance of that particular selection, but I honestly look at it from a practical point of view without delving into the esoterics, and it becomes clear to me that would have just been a very well-known allegory at the time. And considering our organisation is said to have come from the traditions of stone guilds, then naturally the building of a giant stone monument would have been a very fitting story to use. And you say very very fairly that we're talking about building a monument to God. I interpret God or references to God as the greater good, or the greater good of humanity. And I think ultimately, if we're building a strong temple in ourselves, a temple being a representation of us, the man, the inward man, then we are doing a service to the greater good by building up strong foundations of character. And that's what I think it does. And that's looking at it as about as esoterically as I'm probably able to.
No, I agree with you there, Jack. As in the building of the temple of ourselves and towards the gods, as Rob's referenced. But as you said, it's come out of stone guilds, so let's make the obvious link there. What's most of the stone buildings that would have been being built at the time would have been some house of religion, be it a church or a temple or a castle or something. So that's what they were building at the time. So in my mind, it links automatically to that coming out of the stone guilds to the story of the Bible there.
That'd be my guess. But I think that the Abrahamic, and when we say Abrahamic, we're talking about the religions that draw their lineage back to the the children, the God of Abraham, which the Islamic, Christian, and Judeo texts do. I think it's a very tangible and effective allegory that we can use today, recognizing that it is an allegory and it isn't really dependent.
It is a top allegory, Jack, and I do like your take on it.
Very nice of you to submit to my arguments there, Rob. Anything else on your list? Did you have anything else on your list?
No. You're just going to pick on me.
Tell me one more. Throw one more at us. I won't say anything.
No. I don't think as fast as you, Jack. I've got to look through my... got a notepad document in front of me.
Meanwhile, while he's
question
thinking...
marks on it.
Tick, tock, tick.
Got a list of religions. Question marks to myself. I went through... I was thinking...
I've got a question for you, Jack.
Go ahead.
So we're talking Freemasonry generalised here, and we generally linked the craft in general. We start looking at some of the dependent bodies. They're definitely getting more streamlined towards the Christian story. What's your opinion there, being in those orders and myself and Rob not so much? Is it worth brushing over that, or do we just stay away from that line of thought altogether?
Well, I think there's a clear hypocrisy in what I'm saying, in the sense that the majority of the appendant orders that we can join are based on a religious test of Christianity. I think that's just a reflection of the fact that the majority of members over a long period of time have been Christians. And they've gone off and not found, obviously, the craft satisfying enough in that respect, and created Christian Masonic institutions to satisfy that need. So obviously my papers focus on the craft, but you bring a good point into this, and that is that ultimately, there is a bent towards Christianity in the sense that the appendant orders are Christian. Will that change? I think it will. I think the ancient accepted Scottish Rite in Australia, how they used to have a pure religious test of Christianity. Now they've moved away from that in some respects. They've set up chapters that have what they call a secularized approach. So they've taken out all reference to Christianity, despite that the 18th degree itself is really it is entirely focused on the resurrection of Christ. And that's what it's about. It is about this idea of Freemasonry being perfected. It's called a perfection ceremony, through the realization of the New Testament. It's incredibly Christian, but they have managed to find a way to take out the requirement for that and to take away the religious references and focus on the allegory itself, which is this idea of resurrection and enlightenment and a new light and new knowledge and that sort of stuff, and build a secularized version. So will these orders head in that direction? Maybe they will, and probably a good thing.
That's good to hear. That's really good to hear. I think that needs to happen, especially if we want those. And what I believe, my extra degrees I'm in Mark and Chapter are beautiful ceremonies, and from what I've heard, the other ceremonies are exciting, and I can't wait to be part of them one day. But it's good that there is movement towards that way, in my opinion.
I mean, can there be a Knights Templar degree that isn't Christian? I'd say that it's possible. As ridiculous as that might sound. If we take it purely from an allegorical point of view, then why not? The Shriners are based on some of the traditions of the Arabians. There's no religious test there.
No. Yeah, another podcast or two in those topics themselves.
Probably.
Just one final reflection I had, Jack, and I don't know if you've got any data about this. I know in Australia we're saying religion is declining, and we're seeing that as a contributing factor to the decline of Freemasonry. But in countries or districts or whatever, so just jurisdictions where religion is strong, are they having the same challenges for Freemasonry?
Yeah,
Can we see the same links?
I think so. I mean, one only has to look to the great big scandal of the Catholic Church and pedophilia to see how people who are devout believers in Christ, for example, are moving away from those institutions and finding any institution linked to those institutions as something that endorses that sort of behaviour. Now, that's not to disparage the entire Catholic Church, but there is no doubt that, especially in America, and if you look at our graph, the big move away from the Catholic religion has been in a large respect as a result of some of the big PR issues they're faced. So I think there is generally in Western society, maybe in some countries, more belief than others, or outward belief, but there's definitely something in common, that is a distrust and a disenfranchisement with institutional religion. And I guess my argument is we need to move away from our perceived link to those religions, because it's not true, and if it's not true, there's no point us linking ourselves to institutions that are, in trouble from a PR point of view.
No, you're spot on, Jack. I suppose I was putting forward the concept that if religion was strong in some areas, Freemasonry was linked itself to it to its benefit. But I think those areas are few and far between. Unfortunately
so. But I think I think it's been a very good discussion. Thanks for those extra points there, Rob, and for agreeing to allow me to slap you down. Very polite. Right. Look, if you do have a better argument than me, you can write me an email. You can send it through podcast@blueloungesc.com, and of course we'll gladly reply. I'll flick it through to Rob. He's good at writing emails, so we'll let him deal with it.
I'm a gun at emails.
He's a gun. He's a touch typer extraordinaire. Let's move on to the next thing that I wanted to chat about, and that is, of course, I wanted to reflect on 2 years of the Brought to Light Masonic podcast. We should give ourselves a pat on the back. We've all entered this podcast at different stages, so I thought what I'd do is ask you both to reflect on your earliest memory of the podcast, even before maybe you were a host, and just talk us through, if you can remember, some of the developmental experiences you've had being part of it, or listening to it over time. And I guess I will start with you, Steve, because you've been there nearly, I think, pretty much from the beginning, even before we even recorded an episode. I think I remember chatting with you about the idea of doing something like this, and look where we are today. So maybe you should jump us through your recollections.
Well, I've got the best permanent reminder of our podcast with no brake light in the middle of my back car, because I remember loading the podcast gear in on the Daewoo, and we shut the boot, and the boom mic snapped the brake light off. It's still getting fixed, but I've got 2 other brake lights, so that's safe. But look, that's probably my first memories, Jack, are sitting down and recording a couple of episodes with you as a co-host, and absolutely cacking myself. I'm not a confident talker at the best of times when I'm being recorded or thereabouts. I mean, I can spin a yarn with the best of them, being a country boy, but just the passion that we had for where we were going, we didn't know, but we were so keen, and I think it was just pure adrenaline. And some of those early guests we had on were fantastic, such as Alan with the trowel, and something close to my heart with the MAP programs with James Tolk and Brendan Kine, and the contributors we've had have been fantastic from outside the podcast, and to get the regularity that we've had. And take the other side as a listener. It's I've been a binger. I've sort of let 4 or 5 build up or more, and then listen a whole heap at once. And I think that's why I get a lot out of it that way. And I'm forever learning stuff just listening back to the podcast. So it's helped me grow as a Mason and a man.
Well, I'm glad that you've enjoyed the journey, and you've been an essential part of it, Steve. And ultimately, I remember those early days, especially in the day where our first episode's been recorded, the to and fro, your first foray into the podcasting world. And yeah, I really do thank you for the stuff you've done. 2 years, it's gone so quickly. It's absolutely amazing. But what about you, Rob? You've I can't even remember when you first jumped on, but you've been there pretty early. So maybe walk us through what you remember.
I don't think it was that early, Jack. I don't know. What is this,
most.
the second episode I've been on?
I don't think so.
It's like the number of times Jack says, "What do you think about that, Rob?" And Robert says, "Can you give me 5 minutes and I'll Google a bit and then I'll write something down." I don't think that quick.
Our listeners don't see that. We edit it out. We make you look sharp, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
Despite your old age, mate.
Rubbish, mate. Going back through the
enough of the old young fella.
Going back through the episodes, it was because I didn't know you very well, Jack, when I first started listening to the podcast, and they were an excellent opportunity to get to know you and to be amazed by what this Jack fellow was talking about. Like, Jesus, this guy knows a few things. and some of your guests you had on, and you were challenging them about things. I said, Struth, this bloke's barely a master mason, and all right, I better lift my game a bit here. But some of the podcasts that you've had, Jack, and the issues you've discussed, I've found myself yelling at the radio a couple of times, like, what about this? You didn't mention that. Like, you've glossed over that point, Jack, anyway, and clearly you didn't hear me yelling at the radio. That didn't work. But a couple of times I've had this, can they really say that moment? And I'm like, what? Did they just say that? Can we say that? So I think that's been great. I think maybe some of those older attitudes of you can't say certain things have influenced me. And in hearing you come out and say them, I'm following your lead in that regards, Jack. I've got written down here because I took notes while Steve was talking. You'll often get in an argument or a discussion or whatever Jack calls them when he's involved, and he'll say, "Well, what you really need to do, Robert, is listen to episode 21 or listen to episode 13," and somehow you've got a knowledge of what every episode's number is, Jack, what the topic was, and you just throw me the numbers. But I suppose
he's unbelievable. He's like Glenn McGrath, remembers every individual test wicket. He remembers what's on each episode, what was talked about, what hat you're wearing, I don't know, all the above.
And of late, it's been that banter between Jack and old Dave Illingworth that's been particularly entertaining. I think Jack gets right in depth on the topic, and David has a much lighter approach to things. And,
thank God.
At times he breaks up your seriousness, Jack. It's been a wonderful ride, Jack, and congratulations to you and to Paul and to David and to all the people who have done so much work on the podcast and kept it going. What is this, episode 60? Fantastic, well done.
Thank you, Rob, and you've been a big part of that journey, and same with Simon, and to all the blokes who regularly come on, and you've been on quite a few times, and I really do thank you. I love having you on because you really do provide a considered point of view. I mean, you're a lot nicer on the podcast than you are in real life. I think a few of our listeners have experienced that. So
very, very true. Very not much nicer on the podcast.
Much more tame.
No, he is. And I'd just like to say congratulations too, Jack. I mean, I've had a lot of those. Can they be saying in that moments? But to the point where I took myself out of the game there for a little bit, just for my own stance in Freemasonry. But I've always supported your views, and I love the way that the podcast, and especially you and Dave, challenge each other and challenge the norm in Freemasonry, not just in our jurisdiction, but across borders.
Yeah, I think we've become something we didn't set out to become, unintentionally, but at the same time become an important part of giving voice to the membership. I think that's very important. But before we jump into that, I'm going to ask Paul. He's sort of clicking away there on the computer now. Paul, I remember you were part of the Brought to Light Masonic podcast sort of team even before you became a Freemason. I think that by the time you became a Freemason, we're up to episode 20 or something. So maybe give us your reflections on the journey. 2 years. It's. I remember the first... Just going to say this, the first night the first episode aired was the 4th of July 2016. We went to a big Garibaldi function that night. We got a limousine, we got really drunk. It was a great night, fantastic night. And I remember the episode going out and I thought, I don't know how this is going to go, but I got a good feeling about this, and there was a lot of preparation. And just the excitement at that time, and to think we're 2 years later is incredible. So what's the journey been like for you? Maybe give us some of your reflections.
Well, the Brought to Light podcast is one of the main reasons I decided to be a Mason. Only because I didn't understand a word you were talking. I didn't understand you or James, which was a part of the first episode. I also remember the first video you ever did for the Brought to Light Masonic podcast, and it was an announcement video, and it was all about how this is the first Southern Hemisphere Masonic podcast, and it's going to be great, and it was a small room in the back of a lodge, and our equipment was dated, and it was all really old and shabby, but it was still very interesting, and I still wanted to be a part of it. So I'm glad you kept it up. I'm glad you held the mantle for as long as you have. Not that you're leaving, hopefully, but
No,
but you,
don't
but,
play on it.
but you've done a great job. I'm happy to be a part of it. If you're on YouTube, you'll see that all our equipment is a lot better than it was. So we've made tremendous progress with our guests, with our hosts, with our quality, with everything. So once again, like they said, congratulations, Jack. I'm just happy to be a part of it, mate, and hopefully we do well in the future as we've done in the past.
Well, I think he undersells himself a bit there, because the man who puts in the endless hours, I'm talking countless hours, editing, posting the videos, updating, you name it. Paul is the technical brain behind this podcast. The amount of ums and ahs he's had to edit out over the past. I mean, there's been some episodes where I've listened to the originals and thought, I can't use that. That's not going out. And they've been very important interviews, like once-off interviews we'd never be able to do again. And I remember, kicking and screaming and yelling and swearing and, throwing things. And Paul coming in saying, all right, I'll have a crack at it. And 8 hours later, 3 o'clock in the morning, he's got to be up at 7 or... No, earlier, so 5. And he's still working away, and he produces this brilliant... beautiful thing. It makes us all sound a lot more articulate than we actually are, and thank you very much for all you do, Paul. You keep this podcast going. That's probably the only reason I'm here today again, because I got a kick in the ass being told I had to record another episode. So there you go. So thank you for what you do, and obviously thank you to everyone. And I should do a shout out to James, man, Brother James, who's left the craft since the 2 years ago that this started, and I believe he's coming back at some point. He's reached out to me recently, and I just want to say, good luck, James, for everything you've done, but thank you very much for being the first voice on this podcast. If you listen to episode 1, I'm not the first voice you hear, it's James. And James was one of the people who made this possible through his enthusiasm and effort, and his passion also for the idea of Freemasonry being broadcast. My reflections are pretty straightforward. I think this has become a very important part of the institutional fabric of Freemasonry, at least in Victoria. I think that we play a very important role in not only communicating to the public about what Freemasonry is and some of the intricate aspects of, its symbolism and its practical use in our lives, but it's also become a very important place for debate, for discussion, for democracy in action, and for accountability. One of the biggest concerns I've got about Freemasonry is its accountability and the accountability of its leadership. And this podcast has become such an important place for reasoned, fair, and considered discussion about issues to take place, with there being a chance for both sides to reflect their views and to make the case to the membership. I think that part of the grassroots movement around the empowerment of membership in Victoria has been due to this podcast. And I want to thank all our listeners, wherever you may be, for giving us the opportunity and privilege to be able to speak to you on the regular basis that we do. You do get a window into our lives. I suppose, like Rob said, he got to know me a little bit through the podcast. And I have to say, sharing that opportunity, that window of my life with you has been something that I'm very honoured to do. And the fact that you find me interesting, and the fact that we've had so many instances where we've travelled interstate or even overseas, and people come up to you and they tap you on the shoulder and they say, I know who you are, I've never met you, you've never met me, but I know you. And or they say things like we had in Tasmania that, this podcast has changed their lives. I mean, that's it's absolutely a privilege. So it's been a great 2 years, and we look forward to growing from strength to strength for the next 2 and more. And we wouldn't be able to do it without you. So thank you very much for that. And maybe we should get on to some upcoming shameless plugs and events. And I'm happy to start once I can unlock my computer. It's being a bit naughty, but maybe does anyone have any shameless plugs for upcoming events?
I got a upcoming consecration, Jack, a new lodge that I'm a member of, Concordia, in Traralgon area, a new dining lodge, kicking off very soon in, I don't know, I think it's September. We're consecrating. I think I'm the foundation chaplain, just sitting up there whispering to the Worshipful Master. So looking forward to that. And I'll make a shameless plug about a YouTube video, a Facebook video that we released through the Commonwealth Lodge recently, where we in the south we did a rendition of The Man from Ironbark, a very comical Banjo Patterson poem, And the Deputy Grand Master, Right Worshipful Brother Richard Elkington, played the part of the man from Ironbark, and we got him in the chair and we put shaving cream on him, and it was a fun event. Get onto YouTube, Facebook, look it up, the man from Ironbark. You will be entertained.
He was a very good sport, wasn't he, the Deputy Grand Master in that video?
Oh, yeah.
He played along well, and it's good to see that our leaders have a bit of human left in them by the time they get to those positions, so it's good. But I've got a couple of shameless plugs before we get to you, Steve, because I'm sure you've got a lot of things to plug. Of course, we have the Future of Freemasonry presentation being done by no other than me on the very paper that you've been listening to. So if you do want to hear more, a more detailed presentation, get along to Lodge Amalfia, which is going to be the Bayside Masonic Centre at 5 p.m. tiling next week. I believe it's going to be the 15th or so of July. And get along and hear more about my paper, Completing Our Allotted Task While 'Tis Yet Day, and talking about the future of Freemasonry. I'm very happy that the Lodge has invited me to come, and I look forward to being there and obviously making the presentation as best as I possibly can. On the 18th of July, which is coming up pretty quickly, also have the FMV Moot, which of course is going to be the big competition that is going to include a presentation, I guess, in a courtroom before real judges of a mock legal problem where the contestants are the best legal students, I guess legal mooting students from the universities here in Victoria, who will be getting up and presenting a case as though they were in court regarding the problem that's been set. And they'll be doing that in the name of Freemasons Victoria, and they'll be doing that with the support of the Blue Land Social Club, the Academic Lodge, Wesley Collegians Lodge, and of course the Lodge of the Golden Fleece. And that's happening at 5 p.m. on the 18th of July. $10 a ticket. You can jump on the Blue Land Social Club website and get access to our try booking. And of course, you'll also be able to access tickets right up until the event. So please get in early and book and see a great presentation. We're going to be presenting the first inaugural Austin Ash trophy, which is named after a former Grand Master and a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory here. So please get along to that event.
Those listeners who are not on the bar as you are might not know what the word moot means. Can you give us some explanation about what actually will be going on?
So basically, a moot is a word that is used to sort of I don't know what the actual definition is, but basically when one's to say a moot point, it's something to do with a debate or a dispute, but usually it's something of no practical significance. To say moot, it's a mock question. So what will be happening is we'll be having a mock hearing. It won't be a trial, so it won't be a jury or witnesses or anything like that, but a mock hearing based on a appeal of a criminal matter. Now, the criminal matter that's been set before the contestants is the death of a child, which has been charged under the Crimes Act. And obviously, there's some legal questions around whether or not it actually happened and whether or not the person was falsely convicted. So a bit of legal drama, and they'll be getting up before the real judges and they'll be arguing points in favour of... One side will be arguing that the conviction should be quashed, and the other side will be arguing that the sentence was too low. And that it should be increased. And it'll be before His Honour Justice Priest, a Court of Appeal judge, His Honour Judge Trapnell of the County Court, and His Honour Magistrate White of the Magistrates Court. So we got all three tiers and jurisdictions of the legal system here in Victoria with very experienced judges who have agreed to participate in this vital. And the Grand Master obviously will be there making a presentation as well. So it's going to be an exciting night, so get along.
Fantastic. Well done for putting that together, Jack. Fantastic.
And a shout out to Michael Pavlidis, who's been very, very much the leader of this, and we're looking forward to being there. The last shameless plug I've got is obviously the big event that's happening in the West Wimmera, and that's here in Victoria with our good friends out there. And we've got on the 10th of August 2018 the Horsham Greyhound Club, which is in McPherson Street. There'll be from 6 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. a meet and greet with the Grand Master, Deputy Grand Master, and Grand Officers. Now we had a conversation, didn't we, at the last state executive meeting of the Blue Lounge Social Club of Victoria, where Brother Reese said that he hadn't seen, or that jurisdiction hadn't seen, a Grand Master since the 80s, and we said, well, we can change that, and we reached out to Brother Keefe, and by to his credit, he's agreed to go up with the entire Grand Team and the Deputy Grand Master for a weekend in Horsham to meet and greet as many of the local Freemasons as possible. That's being hosted by the Blue Land Social Club. Not only is that symbolic of the fantastic role that we can play in ensuring that grassroots Freemasons are engaging with our leaders, but it also shows the respect and admiration that the Grand Lodge of Victoria has for the Blue Land Social Club as well. So get along to that event, I think, and it'll be a great event. Steve, do you have any events you wish to plug?
I'd first like just do a shout out to all the 32 brethren doing the leadership, or 31, as well as myself doing the leadership course through Freemasonry Victoria and Leadership Victoria. We had our third class last Friday, which was an enthralling day, and it's really getting a lot of young guys up and fired about. So I look forward to talking a bit more about down later in the year. But as far as Masonic events go, I think we neglect to mention now that West Rimmer, they've also got their second shooting day coming up out at Hopeton. I believe that's coming up. I'm not sure the exact date, but we'll get that up there. It was a very successful day they had last year, and that'll be coming up. As far as in the local area, the Northern District, we're working on a movie night or day with a bit of a barbecue. Date to be set, and it'll be we're aiming at Masonic guys visited 80 lodges in 80 different places and done a movie on it, or documentary style. So we're hopefully going to get that up and running very shortly. We've got the personal plug. We've got the installation of Lick Laramore at Brunswick United, Jack, which puts you one spot away for next year. So very exciting times. I've just skipped a couple of spots. One of my lodges has gone in as senior warden, so Jack and I could be going in pretty close together next year. So watch that space for that. That's all I've really got shameless plugs for, apart from personal Masonic stuff, as the education is still happening. And I implore you, wherever you are out there in Masonic land, if you have a lodge of instruction near you, get out there and use it, because we need to keep those important things going.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you very much, Rob. I think as that has been a fantastic way to wrap up this episode 60 of the Brought to Light Masonic Podcast. You've been listening, obviously, to episode 60, which has been dedicated to a discussion in the continuation of our Future-Proofing the Craft series, which is focusing on my paper, Completing Our Allotted Task While It Is Yet Day. And we discussed specifically today the role of religion and the declining religiosity in society and its impact on Freemasonry in the 21st century. We've also discussed the 2-year anniversary of the Brought to Light Masonic Podcast, and we will be back next week or the week after, depending, with episode 61. You'll either be talking back with us or you'll be listening to Bobby Mitchell and his team all the way from Illinois, the Blue Land Social Club of Illinois in the United States of America. Until then, thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Brother Jack Aquilina, and we'll speak to you in the next week or two.
Cheers, Jack. Cheers, everyone.
You've been listening to the Brought to Light Masonic Podcast, bringing you to light through discussions and research papers about Australian Freemasonry and the Victorian jurisdiction in particular. We look forward to speaking to you on our next edition, and until then, we are happy to meet, sorry to part, and happy to meet again.